able to gather, that would be great. So welcome back, everyone. Thank you for making up some time, and to keep with that, let's get ready. So I would like to welcome to come forward a friend of mine, but also she's an ordained minister. They are an ordained minister. Shonda is incredibly thoughtful, research-based, data-driven, a minister, an activist, an author of 5 books. There are copies of her most recent book out on the mission team table just outside the door. If anybody would like one, I just had them sent here because I thought people may want one after they hear Shonda speak. So Shonda is a graduate of the University of Chicago Divinity School, as am I, and we are both graduates of the Disciples Divinity House there. Shonda has done exceptional work with creating visions for ministry in places where previous folks thought that there may not be space or room or energy for ministry. So I would like to invite Shonda forward to speak to us about ancestors and the ancestors that we hope to be. Shonda Ja.
Friends, it is such a gift to be with you. Thank you for inviting me here. I am grateful to be with you all. I'm an ordained minister in the Disciples of Christ, Christian Church Disciples of Christ, which is y'all's sister denomination. Some of you have heard of it, and I'm delighted by that. That said, my father was Hindu from India. My mother is Scottish Presbyterian, and when I say Scottish, I mean still with the accent and everything. And I was raised in Bath United Church of Christ in Akron, Ohio. Small country church, very much like this one. And so the UCC was where I learned about faith, learned about the fact that it was okay that Jesus was my best friend, the place where I learned that Jesus and justice were connected. Not always from all of the congregants, but just definitely from the clergy. So I feel very, very much at home with you all, and I'm thrilled to get to be with you. I love the fact that the theme for your time today is on Tell the Next Generation, because counterintuitively, my work for the past few years has been looking at ancestors, and it turns out those things are very connected. In fact, there's a workshop I often do on asset-based community development, which is about learning what the gifts of a community are, particularly a community that's only been told about what's wrong with them by outsiders, and what those outsiders are going to do to fix them. So I love asset-based community development as an organizing model. And one of the assets I make sure people wrestle with is, what are the stories in your community that can be assets? As I mentioned, when my family immigrated to this country, we moved to Akron, Ohio. We moved there in the very tail end of the 1970s, when things were very hard. If any of you grew up in a Rust Belt town, you know what the late 70s and early 80s were like. And the stories I grew up hearing were about how this used to be a place you could have a good job and support a family. This used to be a place where the air smelled like burnt rubber, but that was the smell of money. Where we used to have something worth celebrating. I've been gone from Akron for a while, and some of you may remember in, I want to say around 2014, during the Syrian war, that administration said they wanted to create space for refugees fleeing the horrors that were going on in Syria. And a number of cities and states said, we refuse to accept Muslim refugees. They are terrorists. We will not have them in our community. And I remember reading an article from the Akron Beacon Journal where the mayor of Akron, this city that I remembered only telling stories of how it used to be, in a way of saying, and it's never going to be that way again. The mayor made a proclamation saying, Akron is a city made great by migrants and immigrants, by migrants who came here during the Great Migration from the South, by immigrants from Italy and from Eastern Europe, and more recently from places like Afghanistan and Iraq. They have worked hard, they have contributed to our community, they have made it a great and diverse and interesting place where the food is much better than it used to be. And she said, all of those cities and states who are saying they don't want these immigrants, we'll take them, because immigrants have made this a great city. Talk about a different story than the one I grew up with. Having been an immigrant and a South Asian child, I can tell you that that was not the story people were telling about immigrants in the early 1980s in Akron, Ohio. But that's an allusion to being bullied as a child, just in case you didn't catch that. But how great is it to know that this city that I loved and I felt like didn't always love me, and whose stories often made me feel like I didn't belong, they're telling a different story to the next generation by telling a different story to themselves about who they are, and who they can be. And so I had wanted to mention that because as you hear me talking about ancestors, I want you to be aware it's not just about looking back, that we look back in order to move forward in more meaningful ways. Before I get too much further in, I want to mention I'm really excited about doing some workshops a little bit later, and I wanted to let you know right now they are kind of cast very broadly. Come and have a further conversation with me. So I wanted to let you know that the first workshop after lunch that I'll be doing is going to be focused on Adrienne Marie Brown, who is a powerhouse community organizer who wrote a book a few years back called Emergent Strategy. And I think that what she has to offer is really useful to those of us who love the church and who want to create a better world. So if you'd like to have a conversation about emergent strategy, and you never have to have heard of her or read the book to be a part of that conversation, that'll be the first workshop. The second workshop is just me indulging my own personal nerdiness. I've been doing a lot of research this year. I'm starting a PhD in social policy, and I was researching how the religious left of the early 1900s became the religious right of the late 1900s. What happened? And it turns out that somewhere in the middle, corporations got involved. I had no idea. That may sound obvious to you, even if you don't know the history, but I thought we went from religious left to religious right, and it turns out the reason for that was an organization called the National Association of Manufacturers. I would love to tell you more of that story, because I think we have another moment of the power of faith and labor coming together now. So if you're interested in that, that'll be my second workshop. I wanted to let you know what to expect, rather than let's just sit down and chat. So with that, let us be in an attitude of prayer. Listen more often to things than to beings. Listen more often to things than to beings. 'Tis the ancestors' breath when the fire's voice is heard. 'Tis the ancestors' breath in the voice of the waters. Amen. That's a piece from Sweet Honey in the Rock. Some of you got to see them because they have performed at some UCC General Assemblies, and maybe you've seen them in concert. And that's one of my favorite pieces of theirs. I want to give you a heads up that some of you are going to be thrilled that you don't have to listen to me talk for 45 minutes, and some of you will be cranky that you paid just to talk to each other for 45 minutes. So hopefully somewhere in the middle we'll find some balance. But I want to let you know you're going to be doing a lot of work for our time together. I think I'm ready for the next slide. But I do want to frame this in the context of the research I've been doing for the last few years around ancestors. I recently came out with a book called Rebels, Despots, and Saints. And it's called that because we know we have a breadth of ancestors. We have a breadth of ancestors in terms of good, bad, and ugly. We have a diversity of ancestors in terms of biological and chosen, like we were talking about in worship earlier. We have a diversity of ancestors in terms of those who went through stuff a lot like what we're going through, who have some things to offer us if we will listen to them. So my book sets up 3 different categories. We look at primarily biological ancestors in that first section. What do we do with the fact that we don't always know about our ancestors who are our biological ancestors? What do we do with when we do know about them and we don't love those stories? How do we navigate the hard things that we know? The second section is on non-biological ancestors. That's been important to me as someone who has lost a lot of the stories of biological ancestors. It's important to me as someone who has not always had models within my own family for the kind of person I want to be. And it turns out I've got ancestors from my queer community. I've got ancestors from the radical activists of both the South Asian and the Scottish traditions. I have ancestors from the scripture and from many aspects of my own faith life. And I believe that's true for every single person here. And the third section is largely on figuring out how to be the ancestors that our descendants need. So that's how the book is set up, and I think I'm ready for the next slide. So I wanted to share very briefly why why I think ancestors matter to a range of people. So these are not all true for everybody, but all of them are true for somebody. For some folks, I remember coming across a young man in one of the Black Youth Project organizing groups in Oakland, California, and he said, I am so grateful that I was taught how to connect to ancestors because my own family that I was living with were not capable of taking care of me. They were not capable of showing up for me well. And when I felt like I was alone, I had been taught how to reach out to ancestors who could support me when the people around me couldn't. Sometimes ancestors matter because we've been cut off from ancestors and it leaves us adrift. Sometimes we've been cut off from ancestors because we have been taught that our non-Christian ancestors are therefore not those who have anything to offer us. I talked with a lot of people, Black and Asian and Latino in particular, who said, we're longing for a reconnection to our ancestors because we were told in order to be part of the Christianity that missionaries had brought us into, or that we were forced, our ancestors were forced into through enslavement, that we had to reject everything that came before Christianity. That's one of the reasons. Another one of the reasons that people are often cut off from ancestors, and I know you all are doing a lot of work around anti-racism in this conference right now, and you may have studied a little bit about the benefits that white people get from systemic racism. Those things are very real, I promise. And there's one very specific cost that comes with whiteness, which is becoming white instead of being connected to a cultural heritage. In many instances, that means the erasure of ancestors. So there are a number of reasons we've been cut off from ancestors, including oppression, including missionization, including enslavement, genocide, including efforts to erase our cultures, and including whiteness. And reclaiming ancestors can be part of healing a lot of those ancestral traumas. It can be an act of resistance to assimilation, and it can, I already mentioned, reject the construct of whiteness and what it robs white people of. Which ancestors, I think, is the next. Oh, I'm going through them one by one. So there's biological ancestors. There's ancestors from our cultural background. There are scriptural and religious ancestors, movement ancestors, ancestors on the land we inhabit, and I think you're going to be having a whole workshop on land acknowledgement. And for what purpose? Resilience, wholeness, and connection, actual guidance and survival tools. And here's one I thought I would throw in because sometimes people ask, what do I do if I have lousy ancestors? And all the stories are of people I would rather not be connected to. I love one of the lessons I have learned from my Hindu family. We often talk about this notion of reincarnation being about how great that you get another shot. For those of you who know Hinduism, that is the opposite of what Hinduism believes, which is you are doing everything in your power not to have to come back. And so learning about our ancestors can offer us cautions so that we can choose to live differently. We'll be talking a little bit more about that later. So where this idea of focusing on ancestors came to me was I have spent much of my life in faith communities and working with churches. I have also spent about, since I started college, so about 30 years of my life in community organizing spaces. And sometimes those things have been in tension and sometimes those things have been interwoven. But one thing I noticed, particularly after the murder of Michael Brown, when some really powerhouse organizers, particularly youth in Oakland, California, came together, is in almost every event I went to that was led by young people of color, there was an acknowledgement of ancestors. That was true when we had vigils to honor those who had died. That was true at rallies and marches and protests. It was true at fundraisers. Can you imagine a fundraiser where there is the pouring of libations, where there is the naming of the ancestors, where there is the drumming in of the ancestors to hold the space? And I found myself noticing that the people who were calling in ancestors, and sometimes ancestors of a specific culture, and sometimes all of the ancestors, I noticed that they tended to be able to stay in the work longer. They tended to have more courage in the face of pretty rough odds because things got bad in the streets sometimes. And I found myself thinking of how many folks I work with in church settings who have the exact same values and are sometimes a little hesitant to be that bold in getting into the streets or to getting into the city hall or to getting into the spaces where they might cause conflict. And I found myself thinking, I think these young activists have something to teach both of the communities I love so much, the radical organizers and the church. So that's what got me started on this journey. A couple of years ago, I got to preach at a Presbyterian church in the Bay Area, way out in Antioch, working class community, and a pretty segregated community. There's one community that's black, there's one community that's white. This church is one of the few places they come together. Their worship service right before November 1st, which is All Saints' Day, they had an honoring of the diversity of ancestors worship service, because many of them came from Celtic roots. So Samhain was a celebration that their ancestors had engaged in before Christianity. Some of them were Latino or indigenous, and we had a chance to honor Dia de los Muertos. One of the African American members of the church had connections back to Nigeria, and he led us through a pouring of libations. Pro tip, don't use a potted plant when you're pouring libations, because it turns out the water ends up on the floor instead of in the dirt. Nonetheless, it was still a very moving experience. So I loved the fact that this church was saying, we all have ancestors. We all come from cultures that used to connect to those ancestors. And on this day that is close to All Saints' Day, we have a chance to remember that, practice in order to remember those ancestors. So here's where you get to start working, and you'll get to keep working for a while. I'd like to invite you to cluster with 3, 4 people. So groups of 4 or 5. More than that, not everybody gets a chance to chat. I'd like to ask you to sit with this question of which ancestors shaped you for good, for doing good. Who are the ancestors, the great cloud of witnesses, who are celebrating your victories with you and who hold you in hard times? And before we get started, you may have done a lot of thinking about this, or this may be the first time you've ever thought about it. And so saying, I'm still sitting with that, is a legitimate thing to share. And who do you think I should be looking to answer that question is also a legitimate thing to share. So go ahead and check in with each other. I'm going to give you about 5 minutes on that one. there in the morning walks, the dead are not under the earth. So listen more often to things than to beings. Listen more often to things than to beings. 'Tis the ancestors' breath when the fire's voice is heard. 'Tis the ancestors' breath in the voice of the waters. I'm losing my touch. Usually people settle down when I sing. I used to be very impressive. So thank your partners. You'll get a chance to continue this conversation. I think there's going to be 3 more prompts. So if you didn't get to say everything you wanted to, you can pick up where you left off in just a minute. So I think we're ready for the next slide. Right, okay. I have to have a prompt for this one because the image is clear once I know what I'm going to say. But I think one of the things that's been important to me, because I know that some of the stories of my ancestors have been lost. In fact, the last time I was in India, well, the last time I went to my father's ancestral village in India, I got to meet my grandfather's brother, whom I hadn't known, who was a Hindu priest. We're from one of the privileged castes in India, the Brahmin caste, and traditionally Brahmins were priests, which is why when I decided to become a minister, I told my family I'm getting back into the family business. They didn't see it that way, but to the credit of telling the next generation, I have a nephew. When I made that joke, he said, "Auntie, you are making the family business better." Yeah, so partly because he believes in a world where all of the faiths can coexist, where there is healing and wholeness. But I got to meet my grandfather's brother, who had been a priest, and he began to tell the stories of the generations before. And we went all the way back to an ancestor who had been a priest in the Dakshineshwar temple in what is now Bangladesh, one of the very few Hindu temples that survives in Bangladesh. So there's this amazing, rich history he's telling, and at a certain point, I turn to one of my cousins and say, "We don't know any of the women's names in that line, do we?" Patriarchy, what my friends who are doing activism within the Hindu community call Brahminical patriarchy, the marginalization and erasure of non-higher caste, non-privileged caste people, and the erasure of the stories of non-cis men, are collaborating to erase stories of ancestors. And I grieve that in the way that I imagine many of you grieve lost stories, or stories not just lost but taken from you. And one of the places I turn is, there's a section in the book where I talk about how to read between the lines to encounter the ancestors who people have tried to erase but couldn't. But one of the other places I turn is non-biological ancestors, and in particular, spiritual ancestors. And so this picture was supposed to, no, actually one back. We're still back at, sorry. That was my fault, because I gave you the signal because I was talking with my hands. I apologize. So I'm gonna focus on this screen. One of the things the picture is supposed to remind me is of what spiritual ancestors can be, the people who help lift me up when I am struggling. And I sometimes talk about Mahatma Gandhi when I get to this point. I sometimes talk about St. Thomas, the first apostle to India, whose story, if you choose to believe it, is an amazing one. I was visiting my mother's people's island in Scotland, the island of Great Cumbria, and it turns out that we had two saints who arrived there in the 600s, Saint Maura and Saint Bea. If you know Celtic language, those are girls. Our earliest saints were girls. And what I love is they show up, and the town in Great Cumbria is called Millport because it was historically a milling town. And they showed up and they said to the farmers, "We want to teach your wives to read. Don't worry, it's just so that they can study the scripture." And the men were suckers enough that they're like, "That sounds fine." I love that I have spiritual ancestors who walked the same land that my great-grandparents, my grandparents, my mother grew up walking, who were subversive revolutionaries. I love that we don't have blood ties. They were both ascetics. They didn't have children, but they're my ancestors. They model for me what faith can look like, especially in the face of what seemed like insurmountable odds. They weren't going to be able to go in and say, "Women are taking over." Although it was Scotland, women had always been kind of in charge. But they could go in and say, "We just want to help your wives be more spiritual." Subversive revolutionaries, I love that. I am also often not encouraged, heartened, inspired, but challenged by another one of my spiritual ancestors. And this is a biblical one. I find that we often look at the Hebrew Bible and say those were some weird people dealing with some weird things, and we tend to dismiss them. And one of the reasons I love thinking about the people in the Bible, both testaments, as ancestors rather than as saints, is I tend to notice different things and receive different lessons when I think of them that way. And it means my relationship with the Apostle Paul has gotten a lot better since I started thinking of him as an ancestor. Because we can have a conversation now that I couldn't when I was supposed to think of him as a saint. But one of the ancestors whose story has opened up to me a lot over the past 10 or 15 years as I've been trying to figure out my location within social justice spaces is Queen Esther. And it's partly because she could pass. And especially at the end of a long winter, I absolutely can pass. As long as you don't see my name. And when her uncle comes to her and says, "If you won't help us." So for those of you who don't know the story, excuse me, Esther was a queen in a court that was very hostile to the Jewish people who were living in that kingdom. In fact, one of the advisors was trying to convince the king to kill all of the Jewish people. Esther was one of the most beautiful women in the kingdom and had been chosen as one of the king's consorts' wives. And she didn't look Jewish. And when her uncle came to her and said, "They're going to try to wipe us out, you need to use your power," she said, "That's dangerous for me." And Mordecai said to her, her uncle said to her, "You know what? If you don't help us, God's on our side, and God will find another way so that we will continue to thrive. But perhaps you were put here with your light skin, with your access, with your advantages, with the fact that you haven't ticked off the king like the last queen who just got killed because she was too in his face. Perhaps you were put here for such a time as this." And so in the face of Hindu supremacy, in the face of anti-Arab hostility, which my community faces in both directions. Esther's uncle, reminds me, God will see my people through to justice, with me or without me. But perhaps all of my privilege, all of my advantage, isn't just to keep me safe, but for me to have a different access point to support my people. So, for me, spiritual ancestors have been a place I could turn when many people in my community are like, why not just pass so you don't have to deal with any of that? So now I actually am ready for you to engage each other in the next iteration of this conversation. I'll give you a little longer this time because you didn't get enough time last time to ask each other, to share with each other, who are your spiritual ancestors? How are they speaking to you and your current life situation? What have they been going through that can help you? Where might they be giving you courage to be bold in your work of faith and justice? I'm going to give you 8 minutes this time. us in our homes. They are with us in the crowd. The dead have a pact with the living. So listen more often to things than to beings. Listen more often to things than to beings. 'Tis the ancestors' breath when the fire's voice is heard. 'Tis the ancestors' breath in the voice of the water. So I want to potentially reshare with you a concept that a number of Indigenous communities name as a priority, which is the 7th generation principle. And the idea of that is everything we do is informed by seven generations before, ideally, and everything we do with an awareness of the impact it will have 7 generations from now. I wanted to name that because this is where most obviously this theme of ancestors connects with the theme of telling the next generation. I think this is important because whether or not you have biological children, you are an ancestor to the generations that come after. I don't think I need to say much more on that, so we're going to do... I feel like your conversations with each other are maybe even more important than the Q&A, so we're going to do one last round of conversation. Thinking about the ancestors you've invoked over this time together, what kind of ancestor do you want to be? What are your descendants going to need? How does that affect what you want to do and prioritize in however many days you have on this plane? This is going to be a short 5 minutes because we're getting very close to lunchtime, and I want you to continue these conversations during lunch. 5 more minutes. died have never left. The dead are not under the earth. They are in the rustling trees. They are in the groaning woods. They are in the crying grass. They are in the moaning rocks. The dead are not under the earth. So listen more often to things than to beings. Listen more often to things than to beings. 'Tis the ancestors' breath when the fire's voice is heard. 'Tis the ancestors' breath in the voice of the water. This is a personal plea given my years of interfaith organizing work, and in fact I went back to do my PhD because I am hoping about 5 years from now to build a multi-faith religious left think tank. Our equivalent, our version of the Heritage Foundation. And so my personal plea is, if you're engaging in any issue, and if you're engaging in this issue of the role of ancestors in guiding our work of justice, keep the conversation interfaith. I was talking with a friend of mine who is a Purépecha medicine healer from Michoacán, Mexico, just after Queen Elizabeth died, and she said, our ancestors are waiting for her. Not in that way. Michoacán, not Chiapas. She said, they're waiting for her so that they can take her by the hand and said, here's what you got wrong. Here's what you're going to fix now that you're on this plate. I would never thought of the idea of ancestors evolving until I had that conversation with someone from a very different faith tradition. I was talking with a friend of mine who was raised Hindu, is now Buddhist, and when I asked her about ancestors, she said, it changed my life when I realized everyone I talk with, I have been their mother. Everyone I talk with, they have been my mother. The way I think about my interactions with people has shifted because I had that conversation with someone from a very different faith with a very different worldview. I hope that we keep having these conversations. I hope they keep making us bolder. I hope that the rebels and despots and saints in your life continue to guide and shape and hopefully teach you what not to do as well as what to do. Thank you so much.
Just some minor housekeeping things. Matt has some things. We feasted spiritually this morning, and now we're going to feed our bodies. I'd like for France to stand really quick, just so everybody is aware. If you'd like to say hello to France, our conference minister, over lunch. And Jim Schlief is here from United Church Camps Incorporated, so he's also available for conversation. And you have a... You can pray. You can pray.
No, you pray. Okay. The announcement I've been asked to make from the hospitality team is that there are 2 sets of tables to serve yourself lunch from. One, they both start, so if you're going out in the space, they both start on this end and go that way. There is one that's obvious at the end of the room where there's food laid out. There is an exact duplicate of that through the doors in a hallway by the kitchen, so that we have 2 tables that you can serve from and go down both sides, so we can have 4 serving lines and do this as quickly as we possibly can. We've got about 45 minutes for lunch-ish. So we invite you into that and are grateful.
Just having been a pastor for a long time, I found it's much more efficient to bless our meal now. So, gracious God, we thank you for being in our midst this morning, and we ask that you would continue to be with us as we have table conversation and as we have lunch together. May this food strengthen us for our afternoon of work and learning together. And may your Spirit flow upon this whole entire gathering, that we might be bolstered in our witness and in our ministry that we do together and in our lives. In the name of Jesus, your Son, we give thanks for this food. Amen.
One other quick announcement. We have a trail that runs around the edge of the property here. It's like 22 acres, so it's a